Tariffs, export controls, trade wars. 2025 was certainly an exciting year in the world of trade. And China performed extremely well despite all the volatility and disruption with record high exports. Welcome to China Pulse, the new video explainer series by the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Ilaria Mazzocco, Deputy Director and Senior Fellow with the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics, and I'm joined by my colleague Ryan Featherston, Associate Fellow. Welcome, Ryan.
Thank you, Ilaria. Always happy to be here talking about some data with you.
Yeah, and today I know you brought in a lot of data to talk about what happened in trade with China this year.
Yeah, so I think as you mentioned at the beginning, China had a record year in trade. So we can see here this big blue block right here. That's China's exports, reached around $3.8 trillion. So record exports from China. And the important part too is if you see this red line, China actually also had a record trade surplus. So China's economy still remains really in balance. It exports a lot more than it imports. And so exports are continue to be a really important part of China's economy and its growth.
Well, tell me a little more about the role of exports for the Chinese economy, because of course we know there are some issues with Chinese economic growth and structure, and of course domestic demand has been a big issue. Yes,
so China actually did grow at the 5% rate that it wanted to grow at, and around a third of that came actually from exports, which is really pretty abnormal for an economy of China's scale. So China still is relying a lot on other countries to kind of absorb the products that it's producing. And that's what we see here with these record exports.
And it certainly exposes China to a lot of volatility, actually, depending on how other countries react.
No, and that's one of the interesting things, right, is that despite tariffs, China was really able to continue to export to a lot of different places. This is looking at exactly where those exports went. Is there anything that really sticks out to you here, Ilaria, in this chart?
The North America drop there is quite dramatic, I would say, right?
Yes, yeah. It's a little bit hard to see. This is over the last couple of years. You got a little bit of pandemic disruption at the beginning, but you can see this pretty steady decline in this dark blue, which is North America. North America here really, it does include Canada, but the real story going on here is a lot of trade shifting away from the United States and going to other parts of the world. We can see, ASEAN, that's all of the Southeast Asian countries. A lot of it going to the EU as well, and then a lot of it going to other places in Asia. Our definition of Asia is pretty expansive. That includes places like Turkey, Japan, South Korea, India. So
the Middle East as well, right?
Yeah. A lot of countries in Asia,
And Mexico here is included in the Latin America line, right?
Yes, yeah. And so other regions did experience some increase. They just tend to have smaller flows, right? Latin America, a little bit of an increase, not as much as some other places, right? Africa actually had a really large increase, year on year. It's just that total trade with Africa is still pretty low. So definitely a lot going on in other parts of the world. Other Europe here is mainly Russia. So that's what's going on with that story. And then if we move here, we can actually see another way of slicing and dicing this data.
I love this chart, Ryan.
Yeah, so this is what we just kind of were looking at where, a lot of exports declined a lot to North America. So this is looking at what contributed to the total change, right? So in order to make up for all of those exports that didn't go to North America, a lot of exports went to other places in Asia. They went to Southeast Asia. They went a lot to Africa, the European Union. So really, it's pretty striking that despite, selling less to the United States, China was able to export to a lot of these other regions and really make up for the exports that they didn't have to the U.S.
Yeah, I'd say the rest of Asia increase is very dramatic.
Yeah, it's definitely, and ASEAN being a part of that, this would obviously be even larger, right, if we include that.
Asia overall, right?
Asia overall is really where a lot of this stuff is going.
Of course, as we just said, we're including a lot of countries in Asia,
yes,
right?
Yeah, we have a pretty expansive. If you had a Middle East, it might look a little different, right?
Yeah.
So that's definitely something.
Or India separately, right? Yeah,
yes,
that would look different.
Well, let's also just take a look at what types of products are going to the rest of the world. So this is just a nice chart kind of breaking down, what is China actually exporting?
A bit of everything, right?
Yeah, so the way when I look at this, I kind of divide it up into two big things, right? So I think of the big blue blocks and the purple block. That's kind of a lot of, some includes things that are not as advanced, but it's things that we might think of as, electronics, machinery, laptops, computers.
Cars,
right?
Which we've talked a lot about in our previous videos, which people should go and take a look at.
Yes, we've talked a lot about cars, so please check that out. But China also exports a lot of things, right? Things we might consider maybe lower end, so plastic products, furniture. China continues to export a lot of those, maybe lower value added items as well. And then a lot of things that are, mineral products, that's like refined things. There's definitely more, but here at the Trustee Chair, we tend to focus a lot on this left side of the quadrant and what's going on there.
But there's, let's keep in mind there's a lot of intermediate products over here.
Yes,
right? I mean, certainly machinery is necessary for production, but of course chemicals, plastics, right? That's often stuff that's used in other things, right?
Yes.
To make other things,
Yes.
which of course we definitely know with the whole rare earths situation and the export controls that China introduced, that China certainly is quite important in the process, in the manufacturing process of other countries.
And even in those big machinery and electronics, I think that's picking up a lot of things that are inputs as well, right? So those are not all finished parts, and it's a good point that a lot of things on this side too, some of them are going to be more complicated inputs than they might appear on the surface.
Right.
So
certainly semiconductors would be under.
Yes, they would be in this
block,
big
right?
electronics machinery block. Great. So I think the next question is just what does this mean for the U.S.? Obviously exports are going down, but what does it look like from the U.S. perspective?
Wow. Okay. Well, tell me. Well, clearly we can see the Liberation Day tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs that were introduced in April. Of course, we know there's been plenty of other tariffs as well that the U.S. introduced, the sectoral tariffs on specific sectors. And also that there has been some change in those Liberation Day tariffs, right? Some countries, especially in ASEAN, reached certain deals with the United States, so some they faced lower tariffs. But I can see a lot of disruption here. I mean, I'm seeing what may also look like some front loading on the part of companies, right, in preparation for what they were expecting. Would be a challenging year in terms of tariffs.
You can definitely see that here with the EU. It seems likely case, right? That there was a lot of worry, and like you said, this one Liberation Day tariffs line is just to kind of show that very pivotal moment and change in U.S. policy. But there's a lot going on, right? In there's other tariff policies that you mentioned, and there's other policies going on in the rest of the world too that are probably playing into this. I mean, obviously, one of the first things that comes out is you can see the decline in China is actually really long term. It's been happening for the last this is the last 4 years, right? But there has been this shift away from China. Obviously, some ebbs and flows there, some seasonality, right? But China going from around 20% of U.S. imports being the largest. It was the largest single place that the U.S. was importing from. European Union being a collection of countries, but going down to below 10%. Towards the end of last year, that's a pretty big shift. And then what we've also seen is shifts upwards in some other regions. So, Mexico, ASEAN, Taiwan.
Well, and I know you have more data that can tell us a little more about the story there, right? Because obviously this looks like it might be, direct substitution, but I think it's probably more complicated than that. Yeah,
and I think that's why I think we'll start with ASEAN by looking at one country that's been a really important part of that conversation, which is Vietnam, just to get at kind of what's happening. So this is a pretty striking chart. This is looking at imports of laptops into the U.S. by country of origin. And what we see here is, for a long time, China was the major supplier of laptops to the U.S. Last year we saw a huge shift towards Vietnam, a little bit towards some other countries in Southeast Asia and other countries in the rest of the world. But Vietnam is really kind of taken over China's place in this supply chain. It looks like, what do you think are what are the things that come to mind when you see a chart like this?
First of all, what's interesting is that computers were actually exempted from some of the tariffs that were introduced. So it's interesting that you still saw that big shift despite that. The second thing is, I think, we'll be getting into this, but it takes a while for companies actually to reorganize their supply chains. So when I see this, it looks like, yes, January 2025 is like a big moment, or slightly after, if you look at the data specifically.
Yeah.
But actually, this is probably a trend that was building up previously, and I think that's the case, right, Ryan?
Yeah, and you can kind of see that too. I think you look to January 2023, there was a big increase, right? I mean, Vietnam was increasing. Companies like Apple had opened up manufacturing facilities in Vietnam to produce MacBooks, right? And those were decisions that were made prior to 2025, right? But then you kind of see this forcing function, right? Where, maybe those earlier investments that were in places like Vietnam all of a sudden become more important. They get expanded. There's lots of companies like Foxconn and other assemblers for major electronics manufacturers. They had investments in Vietnam, but then they have to double down as they try to shift around. So that's probably some of what's happening here. Another important part is also China, right? And that, Vietnam is not getting the stuff to make laptops from nowhere, right? And we do see over the last few years that there's been a pretty big increase in components, things like these are both types of semiconductors, so memories, processors, and controllers. We usually think of Taiwan as the major semiconductor producer, but China produces a lot of semiconductors that are, legacy chips, more mature node chips that go into electronics. And there's also been shifts in some other areas, not as pronounced, but lithium-ion batteries, which are not just used for cars, but also go into electronics and parts for phones. A little bit less so, since so far Vietnam, I think, is focused mainly on, laptops and other electronics.
Well, I mean, this is also quite interesting because it's telling us that, it's not just like complete transshipment of a full laptop that's coming from China, but there's actually assembly and production happening in Vietnam, although certainly not the full value chain, right? So that's interesting.
Yeah.
And that's happening despite Vietnam itself facing very high tariffs in the face, during the after Liberation Day, right? With reciprocal tariffs, although now those tariffs have been reduced thanks to a deal that was reached last October.
Yeah, now tariffs are around 20%, and I think they they have the same exemptions that you brought up, where those products, those electronics are exempt from even the 20% that Vietnam is facing.
Right, and it's still, I think, a framework deal, so I think we'll have to see the details.
Yes, but definitely some interesting changes that are going on, and China still plays a role, right? Even if it's not direct exports or transshipment like you're talking about.
And let's remember batteries, just pointing previous videos, that Vietnam actually has its own EV company. So they're also importing for their own other purposes. So they may not be actually going to the US. Yeah,
definitely true. I think moving back to this chart, we can kind of talk about a few other cases. The other ones that stick out to me, at least, are Mexico, which has famously become the single largest source of U.S. imports in the last few years. Continued to kind of see some growth after its own disruption with tariffs as well. But Taiwan is really striking. I mean, Taiwan consistently has been below. That looks about me to like 2.5% of U.S. import share, but it's really gone up to where it's almost at the same level as China. So that's something that I think, it makes me think what's going on here, right, with both of these countries.
Yeah, what is going on, Ryan?
Yeah, so this is something I've actually recently found out, though I think it makes sense considering everything we know about what's going on in the U.S. Taiwan, the clearest case is semiconductors, right, and which we mentioned before, the AI build-out, right?
Right.
That's the kind of trade side of the investment story that's going on in the U.S., where, companies are buying a lot of advanced semiconductors from Taiwan, and they're assembling them into servers to use in AI data centers. The interesting thing to me actually is
that... And of course TSMC is based in Taiwan, and is, even though now in your own hometown of Phoenix, there is a new factory, Taiwan is still, a major producer.
Yes, and that definitely makes sense, and when we see that in the trade data, it's not necessarily surprising. The interesting thing to me actually was that Mexico is also a big part of this AI build-out story. So a lot of the increase we've seen in Mexico in the last year has also come from exports of, things that are called in the trade data digital processing units. That's not a very exciting name.
Chips.
Really, yes. Really, what this is looking at for both Taiwan and Mexico is assembled servers, right? Mm-hmm. So taking a bunch of chips and assembling them into a server, and then exporting that to the U.S. Companies, Foxconn, once again, Taiwanese company, also involved in assembling these servers. They don't produce those chips themselves, but they buy a lot of the chips, they assemble them to the server. In Mexico, they have a facility that they're continuing to invest in. They upped their investment last year. They assemble in Mexico, and then they sell it to the US. And so you see a lot that's coming directly from Taiwan, but a lot that's coming from Mexico.
And the rest of the world has also had an increase, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it really reflects this AI boom that we're experiencing in the United States at the moment, right?
Yes, and so I think that's the part that I wanted to get at with this is that, you know, there's a lot of shifts that are happening that can't just be explained by China. So it's important to always look at the data. You know, this accounted for over 100% of Mexico's growth in exports to the U.S. year on year. Looking at just the first 11 months, U.S. hasn't released all its trade data. But that's a huge shift, right? And so that's something that really doesn't have to do too much with China. It has more to do with, you know, forces in the U.S. and also with Taiwanese companies that are investing there. So it's important to look into the data and see what's actually going on.
Yeah, well, really interesting. Thank you. Do you have any more data for us today?
No, that's it for today. And I think there's definitely going to be more things that we're planning on checking out and looking at.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think this has been really interesting, but we'll certainly be watching for more data. And we'll be updating you with new data and new insights. Please continue to follow us at China Pulse, and also please visit the CSIS website, csis.org, for more insights on China from our team and also all the other experts at CSIS. Thank you.